How me being a Raiders fan, first and foremost, has helped put me in position to be who I am and what I am to this day. That comes up on Monday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast for July 1st, 2024.
You are Locked On Raiders, your daily Las Vegas Raiders podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome here, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen of the day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to get the latest edition of the show as soon as it becomes available. And as always, if you're checking us out on YouTube, we appreciate that. Show's growing in a major way. That's because of the support of Raider Nation and because of my man, Ari. Ari does a great job each and every day getting us up on YouTube, making sure we're looking good, we're sounding good. We shout him out and we appreciate him. He's on Twitter at Ari Produces. I'm on Twitter as well, as many of you know, at your boy Q254. Feel free to hit me up. And you could also want to be a part of the show, hit us up on the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line, 707-654-4693. Coming up on today's show, it's going to be a little different than normal after being off for a handful of days for a little R&R, a little rest and relaxation, a little vacation time, the one vacation I take each and every year. We're back. But like I said, the show's going to be a little bit different here on the Locked On Podcast Network. They always like to kind of reintroduce who we are to the audience since there's new listeners and new viewers of the show each and every day. Like, we don't know who comes in, who comes out, who's been around for the long time, who's been around for a short time. And some people might not know who the hell I am. So I'm supposed to make sure that I reset, and I'm supposed to make sure that I kind of reintroduce who I am. But most of the time, I always feel like we got so much going on that we don't really have time for that. So at a time that's a little bit, slower of year, as we're about 3 weeks away from training camp, obviously it'll get ramped up. I figure why not now, since I just got back from vacation anyway, why not go ahead and kind of reset the show and kind of give a quick introduction and reintroduction to who I am. So we'll do that coming up in segments number 2 and segment number 3. Segment number 1, we'll do some news and notes, whatever was kind of going around while I was on vacation. Again, it's not a whole lot since it is a slower time of year, but we'll do that here in segment number 1. We'll do that as soon as I tell you about the title sponsor of the show, which is FanDuel. Make every moment more. The playoffs, they're a done deal, right? The finals are over. We know who the champions are in the NBA. We know who the Stanley Cup final champions are as well. So this summer, FanDuel is hooking all customers up with boosts or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. So off top again, about 3 weeks away from the start of training camp in Costa Mesa. Looking forward to that. And I'm really looking forward to that after hearing from a guy like Travis Kelce, the Chiefs tight end. He was on the Bussin' with the Boys podcast with Will Compton and Taylor Lewan. And obviously that's a very, very popular podcast, but not normally do I bring sound of a Chiefs to the podcast, right? Not normally am I going to have Travis Kelce sound on the show, but I thought it was pretty interesting when you heard when he was asked about the turning point of the 2023 season. We know the Chiefs went on to win the Super Bowl. They're back-to-back champs. They want to win for a third time in a row. The Raiders and every other team in the league will have something to say about that, but I found it very interesting, and this little soundbite and little clip has been floating around social media a lot over the course of the weekend, but I found it pretty interesting when he said what the turning point of the 2023 season was.
We got our ass beat by the fucking Raiders on Christmas.
The Raiders
and ruined Christmas.
God,
dude, Pace has got he had those dudes ready to brawl right there on the field.
They are kind of taking old school Raiders mentality.
100%, man, and I love that. And I was like, man, if we play with that kind of edge or that kind of like toughness, that kind of like don't with us mentality, like we won't be stopped.
Yeah.
And it just kind of it ended up like that. But that Raiders game was definitely one of the turning points for sure.
So there's Travis Kelce right there. The turning point of the season was that Christmas Day game when the Raiders went into Arrowhead. The Chiefs had the opportunity to be the number 1 seed. They were going to have all the games go through Kansas City. Instead, the Chiefs lost to the Raiders. The Raiders punched them in the mouth, as you heard Kelce say. Antonio Pierce had that team ready to go fight on the field, bring that old school Raider mentality back, which is awesome, which is something that gets me excited. And if you remember correctly, the Chiefs never lost a game after that. That was the last game that they lost in the 2023 season, was that Christmas Day game to the Raiders. And that mentality that Antonio Pierce is bringing to the table, I know that the Raiders as a team, they have faults. They're not a well-oiled machine as far as offensively. We've gone over that, right? We already know the quarterback situation. But that mentality, that bully mentality, that punch you in the face, that we're going to go into your house and punch you in the mouth style, that old school Raider feel that you heard Taylor Lewan bring up, that's what gets me excited about this upcoming season. It makes me feel like they have a chance, right? We'll obviously break down what they got to do, this, that, and the third. We know what we're going to talk about over the course of the next few months, right? We know how it's going to go down. But that mentality, that thought process, what AP is bringing to the table is what really gets me fired up and excited about this upcoming season. And again, to hear Travis Kelce on Bussin' with the Boys, the podcast, talk about that was the turning point of the 2023 season. And he loves it. He loves that stuff, right? That kind of mentality that AP is bringing to the Raiders. So the league is noticing what the Raiders are doing. They might be slow on giving them props. Nationally, they might not be giving them props right now. But the league and the teams are noticing what the Silver and Black is doing. Also, over the weekend, I noticed what the Silver and Black are doing, at least some of the members of the Silver and Black. Max Crosby, Von Miller, and company had their SAC Summit over the weekend. I went to last year's SAC Summit, but this year I wasn't able to. I was on my way back from vacation when they were having it over at UNLV. But Tyree Wilson, second-year guy out of Texas Tech, looks so big, right? Levi Edwards from TheRaiders.com, the Silver and Black production side of things, tweeted out a video of Tyree Wilson and Max Crosby and others out there, and Tyree looks jacked. I mean, he looks huge. My guy Vegas Jess actually sent me a picture of him and was like, man, look at Tyree. And I was like, man, they don't even look like him. He looks so big. And I don't think that's what he's going to be playing at, the size he's going to be playing at. But you could tell he's been in the lab. You could tell he's been in the weight room. He's been really working his tail off. I remember at OTAs and mandatory minicamp, him speaking with us and let it be known that he was working really hard. He was working with Max Crosby. That's clear. That's obvious. Now, obviously, he's got to go out there and get it done on the field, but I'm excited about Tyree Wilson in year two, knowing that he's healthy, knowing he's going to get a full training camp. He got full OTAs. He'll have an opportunity. Instead of going into, year two like he went into his rookie year where it was, a little bit of start, then a stop, then start, then stop because he was coming back from the foot injury, he's going to be able to go full throttle. So that looks and sounds exciting because if he can all of a sudden come on and you've got Max, as we talked about, you've got Christian Wilkins in the middle. You got Kuntz coming on. You get Tyree too, and that front line is going to be real nasty for the Raiders defense, which is something that we all expect. But just seeing the pictures and videos of Tyree Wilson out there at that SAC Summit was pretty cool and exciting. Now, for stuff that has nothing to do with Raiders on the field, and I only bring this up because it was floating around social media while I was on vacation. It's not something I'm going to spend a lot of time with. It's not me being disingenuous. It's just that it's not really for me to spend a whole lot of time with as far as I'm concerned. One, Antonio Pierce's wife filed for bankruptcy. That was something that was obtained. Documents were obtained by The Athletic and also Jason Morin. Jason Morin actually was the first one to report it, but I know Tashawn and Vic Tafer, they went and got the documents and everything. The filing states that Pierce invested in car dealerships that defaulted on their loans, and that's something that I didn't know about the default on the loans, but I did know about the car dealerships. He's talked to us about him, having those car dealerships. Basically, he was named as a guarantor of the judgments totaling over $28 million. It states that Jocelyn Pierce, who is Antonio Pierce's wife, filed for bankruptcy after creditors recently attempted to garnish Antonio Pierce's wages from the Raiders. Again, not going to spend a lot of time with it because that's that man's financials. They'll figure it out, right? I mean, whatever the case may be, it's not going to stop him from coaching the Raiders. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time with it. It's not me looking the other way. But honestly, if it wasn't out there on social media, none of us would be talking about it anyway. So I just brought it to the table because it's out there, and I don't want to act like I'm ignoring it or turning my head to it. Also, former Raiders defensive end Chandler Jones looks like he's going to avoid jail time. He was a guy who got popped last fall for a couple domestic violence charges. He had restrained or he had violated his temporary protection order. So he had done that and gotten some trouble. But as I talked about it last year, it was really something that was, I hope Chandler Jones is okay with whatever he's doing, right? We obviously don't want him doing anything he's not supposed to be doing to, a girlfriend, a wife, whatever the case may be. I don't think that was it. I think it was mainly he was just violating that protection order where he was at her house when he wasn't supposed to be, which is not good. But Chandler Jones was in a bad situation last year. I just hope that he gets the help that he needs. So again, just bringing it up because it looks like he's going to avoid jail time. And like I said, hopefully he gets what he needs as far as the help. Speaking of help, former Raider quarterback Jamarcus Russell, again, only because it has the Raiders involved in it do I even bring it to the table, got removed from the coaching staff at the high school he attended in Mobile, Alabama, is facing a lawsuit accusing him of taking money meant as a donation to the school. And the money was $74,000 check. So Jamarcus has been in a bad place since the Raiders drafted him number 1 overall back in the day. He's blamed the Raiders for all his issues. He, at some point, needs to take responsibility for his issues, and I'm sure that maybe he will, right? I mean, he hasn't yet, but again, you want to talk about get the help you need. That dude needs to get some help too for many different reasons. So Again, I'm not going to spend too much time with that. That's a Jamarcus situation. That's a Chandler Jones situation. That's an AP financial situation. That's not a Q situation, right? So I'm just going to, just leave it at that. But that was just kind of some of the news and notes. Again, slow time of the year. So those are the kind of news and notes that come up at this point. Coming up in segment number 2, how I ever got involved in the Raiders podcast. A lot of people ask me all the time, how did you get involved in the Locked On Raiders podcast? Well, I'll tell you the quick story to that. We'll do that in segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. We'll get to that after I tell you about the title sponsor of the show, which is FanDuel. And I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. Right? I always am looking for a new game on TV or maybe a game that I could be at. The playoffs, they winded down. They got wrapped up as far as the NBA goes and hockey goes. But there's still, baseball's going on. The WNBA is going on. The sports aren't always going to be as active as they are in the summertime. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, Raider Nation, here we go. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. How did this ever come about? How did I ever become a part of the Locked On Raiders podcast to begin with? How did I become a Raiders podcast in general? And it's funny, going back in the day, I think about this story all the time, and this is going to be the quick condensed story because it'll go a lot longer than the show is actually supposed to go. And we all know, anyone who's been listening to the show for a while, that my shows tend to go a little bit longer than they're supposed to. 23 to 28 minutes is what they're supposed to be. Mine average around 32 to 38 minutes, right? And sometimes a little bit more than that. But it's funny, back in the day, a guy growing up in the Bay Area, even when the Raiders were winning, I always felt like the Raiders never got any kind of coverage, right? There were never really anyone talking about it, even from Bay Area TV stations. Checking out the newspapers is a little different than it is now. Obviously, being able to pop online and Google stuff and Google Raiders, and you can get, any information from all over the place. It wasn't like that back in the day. And so to me, it always felt like there was never a lot of Raiders conversations going on, even when they were winning AFC West divisions, and they end up in the Super Bowl under Bill Callahan. We all know how that shook out. They lose to John Gruden in Tampa Bay. But even at that period, and at that point, I was in Fresno working at a radio station, Q97. I just felt like there was never enough conversation. So as I'm on this hip hop station, I almost daily, every show that I'm doing, somehow the Raiders become part of the conversation, especially at that point, right? I'm in Fresno, and there is a lot of, the Raiders are really good, but there's a lot of Raider fans there. There's a lot of 49er fans there. There's a lot of Cowboy fans there. So that kind of goes along with hip hop anyway, right? In my mind, that's what I'm thinking. Obviously, we know with the Raiders and NWA and hip hop how there was just everyone wearing, Raider jackets, this, that, and the other. Yeah, I mean, that's a given. But in that small pocket of the world where I was at in the 559 in Central Cali, there was a ton of Raider, 49ers, and Cowboy fans. So me being on the radio and talking hip-hop music, but then bringing the Raiders to the conversation, that immediately sparked, other fans calling in, talking trash. My boss hated it. My boss hated every minute of it. And he always said, Q, you're not on a sports station. You're on a music station. This is not about the Raiders. I'm like, man, look, we're in Fresno. We're in Fresno. Everyone knows about the Raiders. Everyone knows about the Raiders-Niners rivalry, this, that, and the other. I mean, we talked all kind of stuff, but I got in trouble every single time that I talked about the Raiders, to the point where I got a write-up. Like, he literally wrote me up because I was talking Raiders on the music station. And he said, Q, you're not on a sports station. I was like, I get that. But this all goes hand in hand. But look, we all have bosses, so you got to do what they say to do. So I took a write-up for that one. But it was funny because I always said in my mind, if I had the opportunity to talk Raiders somehow, some way, I was going to find a way to do it, right? I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't know that was going to lead to a Raiders podcast. And it eventually did, but not immediately. So kind of just, did that little conversation on the music station, and then that was really it. It was done. Game, set, match. No more conversation. I end up leaving Q97, going to another station in Monterey, going back to Fresno, and then make my way to Central Texas, where I was at another music station. And that station didn't work out. That station was not good at all. So I ended up going to another station in Central Texas, but I only go there because it was a hip hop station, but they had ESPN in the building. So, I said, okay, look, I'll go and I'll work for you if I have an opportunity to work for ESPN. long story short, I get an opportunity to be on ESPN as well as the music station. So I'm doing both stations at the same time. And that's when my guy, James Arcelana, was on Twitter. And I never knew James. I just read his work because I was always, even though I was on a sports station, I was talking about the Cowboys. I was talking about Baylor. I was talking about high school football. I was talking about this, that, and the third. I was always looking for Raider information, even being in Central Texas. And I would even bring up the Raiders on ESPN in Central Texas, and they'd be like, man, I don't know how this dude gets away with talking about the Raiders here in Texas. But I did it just because somehow, some way, I found a way to get into the conversation. So James Arcelana's on Twitter, and he says, hey, I was thinking about starting up another Raiders podcast. Who would want to do it with me? And this isn't, a job. We're not making money off of this. But I reached out, and I was like, hey, man, I do radio here in Central Texas, ESPN. I'm a Raider fan. I'm from the Bay, this and that and the other, I'd love to do it with you. So he does a little bit of research, listens to a couple of my shows on ESPN Central Texas. It's like, all right, this dude's cool. So we start the Black Hole Banter podcast, right? And so we're doing this show, and we're doing it probably once a week, sometimes twice a week. And we weren't making any money. It was just a couple dudes that, again, didn't know each other from anybody, just met each other on Twitter. We're doing it over Skype, and we're doing, the best we can, just whatever. But we're talking about the Raiders. And it just happens to be that magical season of 2016 when the Raiders end up going to the playoffs. We know how it ended. Derek Carr broke his ankle. They lost to the Texans in the playoffs. But it was that magical season. So this podcast, and at that time, I felt like there wasn't really a lot of Raider podcasts. And there might be. And now there's a ton of Raider podcasts. And I shout out to everybody. I don't try to, say you don't listen to them, only listen to me. Look, the more the better, right? And everybody is not for everybody. I know I'm not for everybody, and everybody is not for me. So it's cool, right? So whatever podcast you choose to support is fine. But at that point, I didn't think that there was very many Raider podcasts out there. So we're doing the Black Hole Banter podcast, and we're having a lot of fun with it. And obviously, in a winning season, you're going to have a lot of fun. I started getting radio requests. I got my guy, Zachariah, was at 95.7 The Game at the point, and he's hitting me up. Hey, man, can you come on talk Raiders on Saturday morning with me or Saturday evening with me? Like, yeah, right? My goal was always to get back to the Bay Area anyway. Like, my end-all, be-all goal was to be back at 95.7 The Game. That's definitely where I wanted to work at. That was where my focus was at. Obviously, that did not happen, and it was a good thing, right? But that, in my mind, is what I wanted to do. So when someone from that station is calling and asking if I could come on and talk Raiders because of what they're hearing on the podcast, I was like, hell yeah, I could definitely do that. So everything's starting to build. That's when David Locke reaches out and says, hey, I got this opportunity on the Locked On Raiders podcast. Would you like to host it? Raider Nation, I didn't have a clue. I didn't have a clue of what I was even going to do, right? This was a solo show, as you know, and okay, so I'm just going to pop on and talk about the Raiders for 23 to 28 minutes a day. Figured, okay, I'll give it a try. Why not? I don't know. The one thing I had in my mind, the one reason I really wanted to do it, though, was because at ESPN Central Texas, I was a co-host of a show, and I always wanted to be the host of a show. And I knew that wasn't a great situation. I needed to get out of there at some point. Again, remember, my goal is to get to 97.5 The Game. I had to be able to do and host a show by myself, or at least be the driver. That's what we call it in the business, as the driver or the lead of a show. And I wasn't at ESPN Central Texas. I was the co-host. So I've said, you know what? If I can do this and I can do it pretty good, then maybe I'll have a shot. And at least it'll give me some practice on the daily. So that's really why I started doing it. I figured I could talk Raiders 23 to 28 minutes a day. Since I'm a lifelong Raider fan, it should be no problem. And for the most part, it's not, right? Sometimes it's challenging, but there's a lot of different subjects to talk about, obviously, and we get creative as well. But, it was just one of those things. But he reached out to me. I eventually started it. That was back in the year of, 2017. That was when, matter of fact, I started it right after, now I forgot his name. Not John Gruden. John Gruden came back to second time. But, man, I could picture him. Jack Del Rio. Jeez. Jack Del Rio fired himself. Remember after that last game against the Chargers, he basically went to the podium and said, hey, I've just been letting it go, or let it be known that I'm not going to come back in the 2018 season. So I don't remember exactly what he said, but he basically fired himself. And then John Gruden took over. So that's basically when I started here on the Locked On Raiders podcast. And now it's 2024. This time has flown by, right? I still remember my guy, Tom Kennedy. He was my first caller on the Locked On Raiders podcast voicemail line, so I definitely shout him out all the time. He was the very first one to ever hit me up. That's when the OGs like Raider Al and, my guy PE in North Carolina and, Vader Raider in the 303, like, some and T3 Raider Facts, just some of the real OGs from back in the day, popped up and start listening to the show. But it's funny because Bill Williamson was doing this show before, and he was actually a guy that I got on ESPN Central Texas as a guest because I was excited. I was like, man, he's from the Locked On Raiders podcast, man. I got to get him on. He's a great writer, fantastic writer. But to know that I was taking over for him, and I'm a radio dude, I was like, oh, man, I have a chance to really make this show really good if I can figure it out. Well, it's 2024, so clearly I figured it out, and that's obviously because of the support of Raider Nation. So that's how I got involved in the Locked On Raiders podcast. That's been going long and strong this whole time, and it's been fantastic. But now, how has it gone from Fresno to Central Texas to Las Vegas? That's coming up in segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Before we get to that, though, I do want to tell you that today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast is also brought to you by BetterHelp. And I just got back from a very much-needed mind-clearing and calming vacation. Really gave me a chance to reset. Everyone doesn't always have that opportunity to make a reset in their life. Sometimes life-changing decisions need to be made immediately. That's where our good friends at BetterHelp can come into play. They offer opportunities at therapy that best fits you. It's entirely online, it's convenient, and available to be flexible to fit your schedule. You fill out a quick questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, and if need be, switch therapists at any time with no additional charge. Talk with someone with no agenda in your life. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, BetterHelp.com/LockedOn. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Segment number 2 lets you know how I became the Locked On Raiders podcast host, how that all came to be. It went from, being on the radio in Central Texas to the Black Hole Banter podcast with my guy, James Arcelano, who, by the way, I'm still really good friends with to this day, right? Still my go-to guy. Still is a guy that I'll never forget because without him, I'm really not in this position. Well, without the Locked On Raiders podcast and all the support of Raider Nation, I'm probably not in today either. And what do I mean by that is the show continued to grow and continue to grow and continue to grow. And I did it on the daily and made sure that I put it out there on the daily. Like I put the work in, and it grew to the point where Raider Nation started knowing who I was, right? And started to really, help me build my name. Because, again, I was just at ESPN Central Texas, covering Baylor like a glove, covering the Dallas Cowboys like a glove, covering the Texans, covering high school football, and really loving it, right? I started doing sports radio in 2012, so really loved every minute of it. But at some point, I knew that journey was going to come to an end. And normally, and I say it in radio all the time, normally you get about a 10-year run and you're good, right? You get a 10-year run and then it's the next journey. So I started sports radio in Central Texas in 2012. I was out of there in 2021. Right, so you can do the math, right? It's that window. So I knew at some point my window was going to come to a close. Plus, there had been some changes in who my program director was. It was David Smoke, who was a guy that, was almost like a father figure to me. And then all of a sudden it got changed up. I was kind of the acting program director while they were looking for a guy. Then they ended up brought back a guy that they fired originally for David, and which didn't make any sense to me. But I knew then that, okay, I got to get up out of here. So at some point, I gave myself a 6-month window. All right, in 6 months, I'm going to be out of here. I've got to find a way to get to Vegas. And I didn't always want to get to Vegas. Like I said, I wanted to get to 95.7 The Game originally in the Bay Area, but I had a couple buddies that I used to hang out with, and we'd have some drinks on Thursday night or Thursday afternoon. And my buddy John would always say, why do you want to go to the Bay? You should go to Vegas where the Raiders are going to be. That's your team. And I was like, yeah, but I'm a Bay Area guy. And he's like, yeah, but your mom lives in Vegas. I was like, yeah, that's true, but I'm a Bay Area guy. So I really honestly wanted to get back to the Bay. And then the wife was like, nah, man, we ain't going to the Bay. It's too expensive. And I'm glad she was the voice of reason, right? Because she was the one that actually has the intelligence and the brains. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. Really can't afford. And anyone who lives in the Bay, and I know there are a lot of people that live in the Bay that listen to this show, understand how expensive it is in the Bay. So it obviously started to make a lot more sense. I'd come to Vegas and visit all the time. My sons played AAU ball all the time, so I would come like once a year, watch them play ball as well. And so I was very familiar with Vegas. But to me, it was not just, I just want to go and live there. But after convincing, talking to my buddies and talking to the wife and talking to my mom, I was like, okay, it makes sense for me to try to pursue my efforts to get to Vegas. So I gave myself a 6-month window. I'm going to get to Vegas in 6 months. And that's, there was guys that were in place as the program director. I didn't want to be the program director. I just wanted to be an on-air host. But, there was guys that were in place and they quit. Then there was guys that were in place and then they quit. And So finally I was like, okay, well, I'm going to try to be that guy because I'm tired of making relationships. So finally I get hired in Vegas. And it was just about 6 months from the day that I said that I was going to give myself a 6-month window. But I was able to sell myself and sell who I was because of the podcast and the way that it had become popular and the fact that I was known amongst Raider Nation. And so I've been, on Raider Nation Radio 920 before I ever moved to Vegas. I was a guest, like a co-host, a couple days a week, whatever, with, Scott Goldbranson on Raider Nation Radio as well. So then I got my voice in the market, and I'm, again, building up who I am and building up, kind of my name and just what I could bring to the table and getting the attention of more and more people. And so 6 months later, it worked out really well where I got hired. I'm the program director now of Raider Nation Radio, ESPN Las Vegas, Fox Sports Las Vegas, 12:30 The Game, and I have a show every day on Raider Nation Radio 920. It's called Unnecessary Roughness. It's from 2 to 5 p.m. Pacific time. So that's cool. That's great. Goal accomplished, right? That's what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to set out to do, is be able to get to Vegas and, do what I do and cover the Raiders. So that goes great. We moved to Vegas in 2021. Matter of fact, my 3-year anniversary is coming up in, probably about a handful of days or whatever, the mid of July. So that's exciting, right? 3 years here in Vegas. I'm covering the Raiders. I'm working with them very closely, right? I'm able to be in the locker room. I'm able to be at games. I'm able to, interview players and talk to coaches, and again, get that up close and personal that I wouldn't have got from Central Texas. Like, I could have still done the job. I could have still done the podcast from Central Texas, and it would have been fine, but I wasn't boots on the ground. So now I'm boots on the ground. I'm at practice. I'm there. It's not like I have to say, well, this is according to Vinny, or this is according to Deshaun, or this is according to Vic Tafer or Paul Gutierrez. Now I can say, this is according to me, right? This is what I saw, and this is what I know of what's going on. So that obviously has advanced me in a major way. But that's not it. Now this is when parts of what I didn't plan on come into mind. All of a sudden, 6 months after being in Vegas, I get a call from the folks at ESPN National Radio, and like, hey, sorry that you weren't on our radar. Sorry that I didn't reach out to you before, but, do you ever want to talk about maybe doing something with the company? And I was like, wait, with ESPN? Of course. Like, duh. Right? I mean, I grew up watching ESPN. I grew up listening to ESPN. Some of the, great personalities that have influenced me, like the late, great Stuart Scott, right? That was my guy. Always growing up, Stuart Scott was my guy. They called me. Like, I didn't reach out to them and ask them if they were hiring and that I wanted to do a show there. They reached out to me after reading about kind of my story. Again, this is the condensed, very short version of the story that I could really go on, and I can give you volumes of this story, matter of fact, but I'm not going to do that to you, right? So it's so funny that they reach out and they just ask me, what my plans are, what I want to do in the future, what my goals are. And honestly, Raider Nation, I didn't know, right? My goal was to get to Vegas, and I'm here. So I didn't think there was anything really more than that. I was happy with the job that I got. Hadn't been here very long. 6 months, I'm getting a call from ESPN. So I was like, well, yeah, let's do something. So start doing some little, some shows on the weekend, some fill-in jobs, they gave me what they guaranteed me, 30 shows. I said, we'll give you 30 shows guaranteed, and that's over the course of a year. And at the end of that 30 shows, either we'll part ways and we'll say, hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for everything you did. Or we'll figure something out and keep you around. That was 2021. It's 2024, right? I'm the full-time host now of the show called Game Night on ESPN, 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. daily. That's Pacific time, 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. Eastern time. And, it's a full-time job. Obviously, I'm stay very busy. I'm full-time on Raider Nation Radio, and as a program director, obviously got the podcast as well. So I say super busy, but all these things have started to just kind of roll and happen and come together. And again, if I'm not on the Locked On Raiders podcast and I'm not building my name and my popularity and my familiarity with Raider Nation and then with me, I'm not the program director and the radio host on Raider Nation Radio 920. I'm also not on ESPN, right? I mean, I could be on ESPN Central Texas. I could be doing all that, and maybe I'm, trying to build up the podcast, continuing to build the podcast from Central Texas, but everything just continued to really grow and roll. And it all started with just me being a genuine fan of the team and always going back to, how come this team doesn't get enough coverage? How come this team doesn't get talked about enough? How come a team that's as iconic as the Raiders, who the late, great Al Davis will be celebrating another birthday on the 4th of July coming up on Thursday, right? I mean, how come this team is not getting that kind of recognition? And I always wanted to be, like I said, a guy that had something to do with it if I could. Little did I know it was going to turn into what it's turned into. So here I am now, again, very blessed. I never take a day for granted. I never want to take a show for granted. I never want to take a show off because I don't want to, act like that it's guaranteed to be here. I think you're only as good as your last show. And if your last show is not very good, you might be replaced. That's just kind of how this business is. So I try to put in the work and try to be as thorough as possible each and every day. I try to be as up and down the middle and not try to go far one way, far the other way, get too over emotional about situations, but I try to be as fair as possible and try to bring, the coverage that Raider Nation deserves. Again, I'm not for everyone. Everyone's not always going to be happy with everything I do, and that's okay, right? That's your your choice. You can do that. I'm so happy that there are so many different outlets and so great shows that are out there right now that get a ton of recognition, and that's great. But to know that, as far as I'm concerned, Black Hole Banter was one of the first podcasts, that I noticed. And I'm just glad that I was able to be a part of that. And it's turned into everything that has come from there, right? From the Locked On Raiders podcast to Raider Nation Radio to ESPN and being able to do all of that at the same time. So again, very condensed version of the story, right? I mean, I can add so many different elements like, Big Daddy Victor Zaragoza, one of my mentors in the game. We met because I'm a Raider fan. Right? I mean, he saw my car when I was an intern at Wild 94.9, and he's been doing radio for many, many moons in the Bay Area, still doing it to this day. He's a fantastic dude. Again, a guy that is a very close friend of mine. He saw my car in the parking lot at the radio station and was like, wait, hold on. Whose car has those Raider stickers on it? Oh, that's our new party crew member, Q. Oh, man, tell him that, I'd like to meet him. And that's literally how we became friends, is because he saw that Raider sticker on my car. And actually, he got me my first radio job, on air personality at K-Win in Stockton. He made a phone call. I didn't apply for that job. He made a phone call and was like, hey, man, I think this dude would be good. Give him a shot. And they gave me a shot, right? Now, I got fired from that job, but, you're not in radio until you get fired. So that was the first time I got fired in radio, and the last time I got fired in radio was at that job. But I was there, and I was there because of him. And to this day, me and him are great friends. So, and he was the guy that was on 95.7 The Game as well at some point, the part of the Three Amigos. And he had me as a guest on his show. Like, my mentor has me on his show as a guest. That was incredible. It really is. But again, everything has evolved from me just being that kid as a Raider fan in the Bay Area when a lot of my friends were 49er fans, right? A lot of my friends in high school, and got a 30-year high school reunion coming up this year. Matter of fact, I think it's the week of the Rams game, October 20th. October 20th is actually me and the wife's anniversary, our 12-year anniversary. That week, I believe the Raiders play the Rams in L.A. That's also my 30-year anniversary for high school, which makes me sound very old. 30 years is incredible, so there's that. But they were all Niner fans, and I chose to be a Raider fan. I chose to go to the Coliseum and hang out and hustle tickets to get across the bridge and get across, go to BART and do all that comes back to the same thing, being a Raider fan, right? Being a genuine, first and foremost, Raider fan. Before podcast, before radio, before anything else, it was just my fandom. So again, that was kind of a quick condensed story of how I became who I am and why I'm here today. But again, just something that I think is good because we do have new listeners all the time. And a lot of times people, who is this Q guy? Where did this guy come from? And how do I know that he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the silver and black? Again, just being a fan first and foremost. That's what I got for you for today's show. Coming up tomorrow, we'll have more news and notes. We'll obviously have more conversation. And again, we're about 3 weeks out from the start of training camp in Costa Mesa. I definitely look forward to that. So until then, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.